Hey, listeners and watchers. I'm so used to podcasting that I forget that I'm recording this. And since the background is just one of the poetry bookshelves, um, I don't really think of people finding immediate visual interest in the map and the map of the Mayan underworld and the poetry bookshelf in the background, right? One day I might actually do up a proper intro and add some starting music. I do actually know how to do that. I did it for the podcast for years, but I also don't care. I like the lo-fi feel of what I do for this channel. And today I'm doing something a little different. I have a splitting headache right now, and I'm doing this just to get it out while it's on my mind. And I have been grading papers for like 3 hours. Actually, I was grading papers for like 3 hours, walked my dog, had a splitting headache, laid down, tried to read a book on ancient Thrace because I'm feeling very like I want to read ancient history, right? It's a form of escapism. And that actually is kind of what I'm thinking about today is escapism. A friend of mine, and you're going to get a lot of these vague stories of friends of mine because, this is a very informal chat and I chat with people and email with people, but since COVID, I live with my partner and our dog, and I see a friend in my neighborhood who's in my COVID circle, right? And I occasionally take trips to the middle of nowhere in Utah. Um, but I don't get out a whole lot. I'm a teacher, but I've become a permanent online teacher. I'm an online teacher now and forever. um, because I'm very good at it. A lot of the skills I had building podcasts over the years and promoting my poetry and whatever are actually very transferable to online teaching, and I'm very good at curriculum design, so that's more or less what I do now. And it's a very big change from the rest of my life for the past 10 years. I've talked a little bit about what it's like to travel and all that. But a friend of mine sent me an article today, and it was, one of those new Substack articles now that we figured out how to finally monetize blog posts now that blog posts don't really matter. I find that hilarious. Um, but it's from Apex Notes, and it's not all who wander are lost, but most are. And I was thinking about that and also thinking about a comment made to me on a YouTube video I did over at Zero on cultural capital, and I did it. It was an interview I did on Pierre Bourdieu, and I know I'm mispronouncing it. I'm going to butcher any French name you give me. I profoundly am sorry. My one visit to France in my life um, was a lot of offending people by trying to speak French and doing it very poorly. Although I found in Alsace Lorraine. Um, that was a lot more tolerated than in Paris. Um, but what's funny about that is anyway the comment was about how cultural capital norms have changed. So access to like high end art is no longer a sufficient form of cultural capital because we can all gain access now. We don't have to know the right art house theater in the right city to see stuff anymore. Or know the right people to get access to the DVD or any of that. Instead, international travel is often a new form of cultural capital mongering, and it's something that ironically I've done a lot of, but not because I have a ton of money. And that relates to this Apex Notes article that I want to talk about today. You know, Apex Notes talks about how people use travel to escape from banality, but this is really a form of escapism. Like me reading about ancient Thrace and and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Yes, I'm going to use this knowledge of ancient cultures to teach. I might even incorporate it into my larger theories of politics, but I'm also looking at something other than what we're doing right now. It's kind of a form of escapism. A lot of my friends, and a lot of them I really like, use politics as actually a form of escapism, where they create a political system, notion, or eschatology, or rely on a couple of political philosophies that are so removed from day-to-day political life that you know it doesn't really matter what is going on in politics. It'll never live up to their eschatological vision. And ironically, some of these people are materialists, who will poo-poo utopianism and then kind of backdoor do it. But a lot of travel now is escapism, and you don't get that. Like, it's useful for cultural capital too, because it shows that you had the means to travel, right? But you often don't uh, deal with cultures because you're just going through. And so the kind of enrichment of travel isn't so much there because it's a location, it's not a sense of place. That's what Apex Notes really points out, that you watch movies and now you just get a location. Whether it's in New York, or like I remember watching Baby Driver, which is set in Atlanta, and it's definitely set in Atlanta. I know Atlanta, and it looks like Atlanta, it feels like Atlanta. You get none of the sense of place of Atlanta though. It's just there. Um, to really know a place, you need to be embedded in it. And so, like uh, when I was a student, I won a scholarship to do a little bit of study abroad for you know uh, a while, um, about 7 months, and I stayed in München, Deutschland, or Munich, Germany. For those of you who don't speak German, and I know a lot of people will tell you my German pronunciation is so bad that I pretty much don't speak German, but I understand it, and Thessaloniki, in Greece. And I don't feel like I mean, I have a love of German culture and interest in German history, blah blah blah. But I don't feel like I got particular experience from that, even though I was, in a European major city for a while. I ate the food. I met people who would tolerate my bad German, but since they spoke better English than I did German, they would often switch back to English to me when I couldn't get my cases right and they got too frustrated to deal with it. Um, I also know that a lot of people go on a venture to escapism to, flee responsibilities, and travel obsessed people often are. You would meet when I was abroad. Um, People that we called had Peter Pan syndrome. It could be men or women, but it was mostly men, particularly when I was in East Asia. And they would be in their 40s and 50s, older than I am now, and they would be drinking every night and avoiding an adult lifestyle. They're basically living like they were college students up until their 60s and 70s, and often they would be in their sober moments quite sad. Um, and you would meet them, in expatriate bars, frequented by locals who were local women who were often quite younger than them. Um, and I ended up not liking that experience. Um, so there's that, kind of expatriate. When I was in Korea in particular, but also, I mean, this was true everywhere I went to some degree. English is the lingua franca, to use an ironic turn of phrase. Um, it's most people in the world's second language. There are regional second language Englishes, like there's Konglish. It's Konglish is a thing that I kind of speak because it was kinds of patterns and abbreviations of speaking that was common to native speakers of Korean when they were learning English. Um, and I remember when you were in Seoul, or even some of the other big cities, but mostly Seoul, you would meet these expats, and I met a lot of them because I was dating at the time, and they didn't really engage with Korean culture beyond a very superficial level. Then try to learn the language, um, and try to understand the history of Korea, or even the specific place they were at. I mean, Korea is a highly regional culture, despite being a tiny, you know, uh, southern half of a peninsula. Where I'm talking about Korea, um, and similar was true in Mexico, but it was much less true. I remember sitting with an expat in Mexico that I worked with, and I'm going to out who they were. Um, and they had also lived in Seoul, and they told me that they found Korea much easier to deal with in transition to the Mexico, because in Mexico we had to speak some basic Spanish, we had to learn the local culture, learn what to avoid. Also, it had just, I've mentioned this before, the Zeta Sinaloa cartel war had just ended, or was winding down, and she was having a hard time adjusting to Mexican culture. And I laughed at this because I was like, Mexican culture is so much easier than Korean culture. But then they talked about living in Seoul, and in Seoul, that lingua franca thing really matters. So everybody speaks English, even if there were actually not that many Americans, but and there were American brands. There were American brands in Seoul, in shops that you could go buy stuff at, that were never together in America itself. Like, I was able to go to a California Pizza Kitchen, a Krispy Kreme, and whatever when I went into Seoul. Those kinds of businesses are regional in the United States, but in Korea they all exist in this upscale. Districts like Bundong, are Gangnam, made famous by Psy, are Mapogu, um, where you could go and do these very American things. Now, when I lived in Yongin-shi, which is actually only about 30 minutes by bus from Bundong. The university that I worked at, everybody spoke English. In fact, it was the dominant language of the school. I mean, Hankoku de Hakyo literally translates to Hankook University of Foreign Studies, but Hankook literally there just means Korea. It's the it's the kind of the Korean name for South Korea. Um, and so it means something like Hankook School of Foreign Languages and Culture. And so there were people from about 120 different countries, but we all did our business in English. But when you left the campus, yes, little kids spoke English because they learned it in school, and they come up and run to you and talk to you. And like the very wealthy people in the area mostly spoke English. But you went into a restaurant, a shikdong, or something like that, nobody spoke English. And 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 while that may be true in Seoul, or people might be hesitant to speak English to you, the signage would be in English. No, you had to read Hangul, you know, um, which is the simplified form of the native Korean syllabary, which isn't very hard. I never learned Hanja, which is the Chinese characters. I know like 10 Chinese characters, um, but Hangul you had to learn, because if you didn't, you're gonna have a hard time eating, and you needed to navigate local tensions, attitudes about foreigners, attitudes about and it was a very complicated social milieu. It took a couple years, and by the time I started getting a grip on it and getting a grip on Korean enough to really communicate, I took another job in the center of the country. So my experience of Korea and Daejeon, which is a big city by American standards, but by Korean standards was considered the countryside, which Americans would find hilarious. But when I and my wife lived there, it was another place where some people had never seen a black or white foreigner before. They'd only seen maybe South Asians, and like kids would stare at you. There's this funny story about the kid who saw us on the Imorte escalator and literally fell over because they were so shocked by our presence. But that's a completely different world than Seoul. Now, what does this have to do with escapism and culture? Well, I had to embed myself in that culture, and it took a toll on me. It changed me. But if I lived in Seoul, I could go to Western foods. I could hang out at Itaewon, which is where the soldiers used to hang out, and go to Western style dance clubs. I could drink Western beer. I could find the one shop that carried deodorant. I know that's strange, but it was hard to find there. Um, it was a world for elites, and elites all spoke my language because English culture, England, the United States, English speakers from other countries were part of a global elite group that the cities catered to. You're not going to find yourself by traveling to that. You're going to find your consumerist culture there. But when you go out to, um, the Korean countryside, almost a completely different world. And it's not because the Korean countryside is poor. Korea is a first world nation. It's just not part of that same hyper urban culture, you know. And you also have to generate social responsibilities, which in Korea was easy to avoid because as a foreigner, you're actually outside of a lot of the very Confucian social codes that exist there. But, when I moved to Mexico and northern Mexico, that was not true. We had community responsibilities. Yes, we were mostly part of an expat community, but we also were known by locals. And we had to try to be good neighbors to them and live with them and know the customs, deal with the things that you had to do there. Um, so this Apex article, which I'll link in the descriptions, also talks about place. And one of the interesting things about traveling around the world, and I think Egypt was the most complicated sense of place that I ever encountered, and I'm still unpacking what I tried to learn there. And because of personal tragedy in my life and political instability, I did not embed myself into the culture the way I did in Mexico or did when I moved into more rural areas of Korea. I also um, gave up learning Arabic pretty quickly, although I do speak a little bit of Masri dialect. See, I mispronounce it. I mispronounce all foreign words. The word in Arabic for Egypt is like Misir, which is related to the Hebrew word for Egypt, which is Mizraim. The Coptic word is, which is the native word is, which is something more like Kemet or Kyop. It's where the term Copt or Coptic comes from. But anyway, so I speak a little bit of Masri, which is Cairo city street Arabic. And when I say a little bit, I mean like I can speak like 20 sentences. And I tried to take a class to read it, and I realized that Arabic was hard. It was hard enough that a lot of people I knew who were educated in Egypt were only partially literate in Arabic or only in like Quranic formal Arabic with all the diacritical marks, but like street Arabic written down often confused them. And they were more literate in English, which blew my mind. It tells you something though that as an American you don't realize. And they participated in a global culture which had kind of even on texting, they text in this Arabicized English a lot of the time. The rich people there. But the poor people were completely removed from that world. And when I would talk to people, even like middle class people who spoke English versus, frankly, the rich people who I taught, and some of whom I worked with, it was a very different experience. I had very different attitudes towards the United States, and it wasn't from ignorance. It was that a lot of the more educated people in Egypt had European or American style values. They watched European or American television. They, most of them are good Muslims, but they came from that way of viewing the world. And when I talk to even middle class people, even if they spoke English, and if I were speaking to them, in full sentences, they spoke English. Um, they often, like they hated Barack Obama because they saw him as betraying his historical roots. They and also being neutral in a revolution that you can be neutral in. They have very complicated views on the United States, but they had not experienced American culture other than dealing with tourists and the few foreigners who lived in their area. And actually, the vast majority of foreigners that lived where I lived were not Americans; they were Chinese and Koreans, and then Canadians. So, but they had their ideas. They often, while I was occasionally mistaken for an Egyptian because I have one of those faces that even though I'm super pale, that I can apparently pass as being from almost everywhere. Um, Except when I was in Asia, I stood out. But um, the uh, the vast majority of people assumed I was foreign, but didn't actually assume I was American. Sometimes they speak to me in German or Spanish, which would be funny because I understood them, because I poorly speak German and Spanish, and since I spoke it slowly like a person who's not a native speaker, they actually appreciated it. But it took them a second to realize that that wasn't my native language either. Um, but I say this though because you have to work to get a sense of place. And when I lived in Cairo, in particularly, each neighborhood had a sense of place. It had a history, and you would really struggle to figure out that history and the class dynamics and the racial dynamics and everything else, right? The codes of hospitality. Um, and when you tried to embed yourself in that world, it was hard, but you got a lot for it, and it did change you. Where if you just treat, you could go there and treat it like a tourist, and I figure most people do. Um, when I talked to a lot of expatriates and people who did a lot of traveling, that's what it felt like. So people ask me why I don't go abroad anymore. I didn't really want to come back to America, but when I did, I decided, this was my home. Now, I don't live in the area I grew up, and I don't actually assume that Americans have a unified culture beyond the media culture, that we all have our each individual idiosyncratic histories, and sometimes we're deceiving ourselves into similarities just because we speak the same language. And when you actually deal with like the cultural norms of Utah versus the cultural norms of Georgia and the embeddedness of place and the kinds of social responsibilities and history there, um, they're often extremely different. I feel like that's been hollowed out by a lot of this experience, and thus travel, instead of becoming a way to really enrich yourself, becomes a way to consume other cultures. Even when you go for, I don't even encourage people to go for like authentic Egypt or whatever, because authenticity there is you experiencing something new as a consumptive practice, right? Um, if you're going to go and live in a place, you need to live in a place, and you need to start thinking about what your life would be there if you were going to be there for the rest of your life. Are you an expatriate or an immigrant? Um, for me, it took me a while to really understand the difference between those two mentalities. And I think a lot of people who talk about the enriching of travel treat travel like they're a tourist at best, or at worst, or an expatriate at best. And I've met ugly tourists from everywhere. It's not just an American problem, trust me. But you can very shallowly engage with the world now. I mean, particularly if you speak English. Another story I'll tell you, and this also happened in Korea, and people often don't realize this when they travel. My ex-wife and I were in a line going into, I believe it was Shanghai, and the two gentlemen in front of us were Koreans, and one of them didn't understand Mandarin or English. And the border agent didn't get mad when they didn't speak Mandarin. I mean, they didn't actually assume that. But when they didn't speak English, the border agent shamed the person. And since, I'm white, they didn't assume that I spoke Korean, but I did enough to help the gentleman understand what was going on and to, give him his passport. Uh, but the assumption across the board was that if you don't speak the language of the country you're going to, um, and in China, by the way, yes, everybody speaks Mandarin, but like the regional dialects are radically different. Cantonese and Toisanese and Taiwanese, and actually Taiwanese is actually like three different dialects of Chinese. They're not even all mutually comprehensible. They don't even have the same like tonal system. One of the reasons why China has never like adopted the Roman alphabet, even though they experimented with it in the early communist period, because it's easier to learn how to spell in. And they, there's the attempt to like adopt pinyin for a while, which is the Chinese way of spelling things, which is why when you look at a lot of things spelled modernly in pinyin, you have no idea how to pronounce it because it's not the use of Roman characters is not actually made to transliterate straight to English. Um, but they abandoned it because it would make it immediately obvious that a lot of the dialects of Chinese were not mutually comprehensible without um, a ideogrammatic writing style. That if you did anything phonetic, it would fall apart. But again, the English and its own form of English, it's not even really, like necessarily associated with imperialism there. It's just, it has the imperial heritage, yeah, but it's not represented like that. In fact, I would say there was the beginnings of, an East Asian, just like there's a South Asian claiming of its own form of English. And there were debates in the, in the scholar community area about that. And so just speaking English didn't even necessarily mean you were part of this global, you know, culture of the jet setters, right? And a lot of us at the university were just lucky enough because of our job to be a part of that. And then we got into the circuit of international teaching, which paid well, and opened up travel to us. And also, once you leave the United States, it's actually way cheaper to travel, my friends. Yeah, and Europe. You know, I didn't spend a lot of time in Europe because it's expensive, except when I would go to like Southern Europe or Turkey, um, you know, and we would do that a fair amount. But anyway, the point of this is that there is a truth to this idea that you know there's a global culture now, and there's also all these ways that you can superficially engage in that culture and not really experience the world. And I also think it leads you to not really exploring your own country because we experience a lot of our country through regional stereotypes and media projections and not in any embedded history of the place. We often treat our own country as something to be consumed and not something that has a deep entrenched regional history that goes back hundreds of years. And and we're a country that you're only going back to like 300 or 400 years unless you're dealing with indigenous stuff, and then you're going back to cultures that are thousands of years old, but have had a lot of their history denied them. That's another topic. I don't get on that another day. So I don't want to make people think that I'm not aware of that or not thinking about it. Um, but it's this hollowing out of the world, and so traveling enriching you is only meaningful if you're willing to be embedded and have responsibilities to the areas that you live in. And as an expatriate, it often takes a while to learn how to do that. And I think that's true in the United States. We're a huge country, and you have to treat each of these areas differently. Yeah. Anyway, that's just my rambling thoughts on the subject of travel. Like and subscribe if you like it. You can find me. I'm not going to post these every day, but I'm going to probably do them 2 or 3 times a week. I have to get back to my regular podcasting schedule. Um, You can find me over at Zero Books channel every other Monday. I do Theorizing Hammer. Starting about a month, I'll return on Thursday. Every other Thursday with Pop the Left. Once a month, I do Mortal Science over at the Emancipation Network. That's a podcast. You can find my work over at Former People. That's my editorial work, which I need to go do some of, actually. That's what I should do after I get stopped talking to you guys. And you can like and subscribe. Um, Anytime I entertain you, it's purely by accident. So just remember that if you like and subscribe. And I'm not making money off this, so at least not yet, right? Share with your friends if you want people to see it. If you hate it, you can start a beef with me on Twitter. I'll ignore you, and you can spread my message for me. That's cool. But otherwise, if you hate it, you don't have to consume it, man. Have a great day.